you guys are anything like me, we forever are trying to find the best locations possible for our videos. Having a better location means that our shots are going to end up looking better, looking more cinematic and looking more professional. So it is a no-brainer that we want our setting and our scene, our location, to look as awesome as possible. But what happens when we just don't have that option? Maybe we don't have any cool locations that we have at our disposal and we have to end up shooting our videos at a very boring location. What can we do to make the most out of that location and still make it end up looking really cinematic and professional? Personally, I am from Cape Town and I am super spoiled for locations. There's beautiful scenes all over the place. But let's take this parking lot, for example, because I feel like everyone in almost any city has some sort of parking lot that you guys could use to shoot a video. It's pretty ugly, it's mediocre at best, but by applying these tricks and techniques, we can make the most of this parking lot and actually end up with some pretty cool looking shots. I think one of the first things that I like to look out for when I'm trying to create interest in my boring location is different types of lighting and different pockets of light within that location. So you can see in some of these shots for inside the parking lot, there's obviously going to be those overhead lights that are going to be not that appealing. They can sometimes look quite cool. But what you want to look out for is some interesting pockets of light, maybe some sunbeams coming in from outside, making some interesting contrasting lights with those shadows. You can see in the second very average location that we were shooting at, we went there at a little bit later in the day, so we had a lower sun and it was creating some nice golden light coming into our scene. And then by shooting into that light and getting some nice backlit scenes with our subject being Hannah in those shots, it creates a little bit more interest, and all of a sudden our average location is starting to look a little bit more interesting. So whenever you can, the first thing you guys should be doing is just looking for light, where your light is shining, what it's doing in the different parts of that location, and how you can use it to your advantage to bring that location to life and create interest in that very average place. The next thing is going to be using angles and just tilting your camera in different ways to introduce a whole new aspect of interest into those otherwise boring shots. So you got to think about when you're standing in your boring location and you're looking at it at eye level, that is of course going to be boring. That's even a way of making a quite interesting location have a boring shot. So we see that all day from eye level and it's nothing really new or interesting to our eyes. So what you can do is by all of a sudden getting really low and looking up, or vice versa and going really high and looking down onto your scene or your subject, it all of a sudden creates interest and you can come up with some nice interesting ideas. You can see with these ones where Hannah was going up and down these stairs, we could look up at it and look down at it. Another thing to look out for is not only changing your angle of your shots, but to look through other interesting things and create some framing of your subject or whatever that scene might be. So you can see we had these nice holes and we could look through them and create some interest. It creates depth in our shots and makes them end up looking much better. Something important to note when you guys are shooting in these boring locations is it's as important to exclude certain things out of your shots than it is to look out for the interesting things to include in your shots. So by introducing some sort of framing or foreground and shooting through things, it's a way of controlling what's been seen by the viewer, what's going to be in that shot, and not just including everything into it. Using some other composition tricks that you guys might know already and introducing them now might really help bring that shot to life. Things like using leading lines to draw the attention of the viewer to the subject or wherever you want them to be looking on that screen. Another one is going to be that foreground that I love to talk about because it's one of my favorite things you can do to a shot to create more interest in it. By introducing that third layer into your shot, now you don't only have your subject and your background, you also have foreground. And another thing you can do with this is start introducing some movement into that shot, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. Something I like to do when doing this is to have a slightly longer focal range. So by putting on a longer lens and shooting at something like 75 mils or even 105 mils, you can isolate your subject and exclude a lot of that background, making sure that your frame is filled up with interesting things Another way that you can achieve this is by shooting at a shallower depth of field. So if you guys have a lens that allows you to go to a lower aperture, giving you that blurry background, that's gonna mean that even if that background is super boring, you can blur it out and make sure that your viewer's attention is being focused on the parts that you want them to focus on, whether that's your model or any other interesting thing that might be in that scene. These things often go hand in hand, and by having that longer focal length allows you to get that shallower depth of field, and you end up creating some really interesting shots where the frame is nice and full of the interesting things that you want your viewer to digest and you want them to notice in that frame. Something that I like to do when I have a boring location is to introduce some sort of props. Even your model itself is a prop, but even further than that, you can give your model props and have them have certain things to work with to create more interest into that. So you can see here, Hannah has this skateboard, which we can all of a sudden use to have her doing interesting things. She can be skateboarding on it, or she can be holding that skateboard. I can use the skateboard to get those nice close-ups that we were talking about and find interesting little details within those props. Another thing is you can see at our second location where Hannah had this jacket, she can spin the jacket around and all of a sudden introduce nice movement into that shot and an interesting element for the viewer to pay attention to, and they're not going to notice that very boring and average background so much. If your shots are generally looking quite boring, something that I find really helps is introducing movement into those shots. If you have a lock-off shot, even of a quite interesting location, there isn't too much going on and your frame isn't changing too much, and that means that the viewer's attention isn't going to be held for as long as if you were to have a moving shot where everything in that frame is changing quite quickly. Your viewer constantly needs to readjust and figure out what the new things in that frame are, where they're supposed to be looking and what's supposed to be holding their attention. And this is something really great to apply when we have that background that isn't necessarily going to hold our viewer's attention for that long. One of my favorite ways to introduce movement is by having something like that foreground we mentioned earlier. It exaggerates all of our movements, and all of a sudden our movements become a lot greater with that foreground rushing past. Otherwise, something you guys can do, something that I love to do, is introduce gimbal shots if you guys have access to something like a gimbal, so you can start tracking and walking after your subject or doing really nice big slides and movements around in your location. All of that movement is going to introduce another layer of interest for the viewer to pay attention to. So next time you guys find yourself in a pretty boring or average location, give these tips a try. Don't just be like, this place sucks, I can't create anything nice here. Try introduce these tips and techniques, and hopefully you guys will be surprised at your outcome, and hopefully you guys will still be able to create some really awesome shots by utilizing these tips and techniques. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something new. If you did, hit that like, hit that subscribe if you want to see more, and I will see you guys in next week's video.